In this week's episode of Bleach, the 1000-Year Blood War arc, Mayuri and Kenpachi confront Sternritter C, Pernida Parnkgjas, Pernida's true identity is revealed at last, and the stage is set for more battles to come. Well, it's safe to say this episode got people talking. Whether you loved this week's episode of Bleach or not, there's no denying episode 34, Baby Hold Your Hand, was a polarising installment of the story, and in a way that feels oddly fitting. Mayuri Kurotsuchi has long been one of the more divisive characters in Bleach, and his battle with Pernida Parnkgjas in the manga is absolutely one of the series' craziest fever dreams. A diabolical, mad scientist engaged in acrobatic combat with a gigantic arm? Sign me up, that sounds fantastic. So then, how did I feel about this week's episode? Well, it's complicated, and as always we'll dive into my thoughts, feelings and opinions as we progress through this week's in-depth spoiler review and discussion. What's not so complicated though is the episode itself. This is perhaps the single most faithful episode of the core so far, sticking rigidly to the source material for almost its entire runtime. This episode introduces us to the first major battle against a member of the Schutzstaffel, although I suppose in the anime you could make a case for that now being Renji versus Uryu instead, and sees Mayuri facing off against the left arm of the Soul King, Pernida, in what would gradually evolve into a very surprising battle. In terms of scale, this is an absolutely massive fight, and although this episode covers essentially the entire first half of the battle or so, we've only really begun to scratch the surface of what makes this fight so good. Mayuri is barely sweating right now, but don't worry, we'll get there. So, as we begin our in-depth spoiler review and discussion of the 1000-Year Blood War arc, episode 34, Baby Hold Your Hand, as always I'll be looking at this episode from the perspective of someone who has read all of the 1000-Year Blood War arc before, meaning there will be potential spoilers for the entire arc to follow, as we take a look at this episode to see what it added, what it changed, and what it took away from the source material. However, before we get started on today's video, if by the end of it you enjoyed this review and you want to see more from me and you're not yet subscribed to the channel, then please consider doing so today in order to stay up to date. It really does help out the channel and I greatly appreciate the support on our journey to 300,000 subscribers. Let's get started then, and as always we'll first take a look at what chapters are covered in this week's episode. In my opinion, episode 34 has an odd feel to it. Compared with the rest of part 3 in particular, it is definitely the slowest episode so far, and that's saying something considering part 3 has already been slower thanks to the improved pacing, but maybe that's to be expected, with it focusing almost entirely on just the one fight this time. Where we've enjoyed fights in this core so far, particularly the brand new ones, they've often only taken up half the episode or so, maybe 10 minutes at the most. But here, sticking to the source material, we've reached some of Bleach's longest fights now, and that is bound to affect the pacing. So, to be honest, I think the team is doing the best with what they've got here. Not only that, but Mayuri does have a tendency to go on lengthy speeches, all of which bring the episode to a crawl, as enjoyable as they might be. But without further ado, these are the chapters covered in episode 34. Firstly, we've got chapter 635, Hooded Enigma, chapter 636, Sensitive Monster, chapter 637, Baby Hold Your Hand, the title of the episode, chapter 638, Seething Malice is the Height of Comedy, chapter 639, Baby Hold Your Hand 2, and one panel from chapter 640, Baby Hold Your Hand 3, Mad Lullaby number 7. So once again we have completely circumvented the Friend Saga, which grows more fascinating the longer it goes on. Although circumvented isn't technically the right word, at least not here in the anime, as we see in this episode the 3 turncoat Sternritter have barely made a move themselves yet. It does seem like the anime is trying to line up all of these events to run concurrently, but we'll get into that in a minute. It definitely seems like Friend will be the finale of the core then, and as I speculated before, I think here in the anime, Friend will somehow lead directly into the reveal of Uryu's true allegiance and the start of his confrontation with Hashwolf as the core's ultimate cliffhanger. But as far as this episode goes, it is extremely faithful to the manga. Almost to a fault, and to that end, this might be a somewhat shorter review than we've become accustomed to in Core 3. In regards to episode structure, perhaps the most interesting part of Baby Hold Your Hand is actually the tease for next week. The poem features Kyoraku Shunsui, and it's revealed that episode 35 is called Don't Chase a Shadow, leading many online to wonder if we are skipping over to Kyoraku vs Leal next week as opposed to finishing up Mayuri vs Pernida first. Make no mistake, we are really only halfway through this fight, and I initially speculated that these two battles would each take 2 episodes apiece, and while that still seems to be the case, I certainly wasn't expecting them to be split up. It's yet another surprising talking point this week that's got the community debating and discussing the episode, and I'll dive into my thoughts towards the end of the review as we look towards next time. So, focusing then on the here and now, let's dive into the spoiler analysis for this week's episode, episode 34, Baby Hold Your Hand. Despite this episode then being one of the most faithful in the core to date, it actually opens with a brand new scene. As Renji is blasted through the chest by Uryu, he collapses to the ground. There were a lot of theories surrounding the end of their battle from last week, including some who speculated that Renji may in fact be alive and unharmed, perhaps due to some shenanigans involving the antithesis. While the opening of this episode doesn't definitively put those theories to bed, it's definitely trying to. The episode lingers on the fallen Renji as blood pools around him. It certainly looks like the vice captain is completely done for, unless someone manages to save him in time. Unless all really isn't as it seems regarding Uryu and the outcome of this fight, personally, I think Rukia might end up rescuing Renji at the last minute, but we'll have to see. Standing over Renji's body with that cold look in his eye, there certainly doesn't appear to be anything untoward going on with Uryu specifically, but the anime could absolutely be hiding the truth from us still. However, we're then treated to one of my favourite moments from the episode. As Uryu looks down at the fallen Renji, we see that someone else had their eye on the battle too. From afar, Leal watches Uryu, his sniper rifle trained on him, seemingly poised and ready to shoot at a moment's notice. It's likely this second shot we get of Uryu is meant to be the angle from which Leal was watching him, and having seen him apparently kill Renji, Leal seems satisfied, lowering his weapon. This is such a great little moment. Whether Leal is inherently distrustful of Uryu himself, or if Hashwolf put him up to it, we don't know. In the manga, the two have a few interactions and exchanges that would lead Leal to be suspicious himself, such as when Uryu hastily prevents Leal from sniping Ichigo at the end of the Royal Palace showdown, and later, Leal's expression when Gerard wonders why Uryu looks so glum as Yhwach absorbs the Soul King. However, both of those moments were removed here in the anime, so Leal's suspicion of Uryu kind of comes out of nowhere. It isn't quite as organic, which is why it's possibly being attributed to Hashwolf. Ironically, the moments found in both the manga and the anime are actually two halves of a whole, neither of which successfully comes together in their respective mediums. In the manga, Leal is suspicious of Uryu, but never follows it up. In the anime, Leal is never shown to be suspicious of Uryu, but follows it up regardless. Anyway, as an incredible, ominous soundtrack booms in the background, Leal turns his attention back to the Gotei 13, who regroup? Considering Leal can still see them perfectly from presumably the same tower he was in last time, though I presume it's possible it's not the case, they barely seem to have left his field of view before coming back together again, which seems to totally defeat the purpose of them splitting up in the first place. With Leal returning his attention to them once more, I can't help but feel them regrouping means one of them will likely be sniped again before Kyoraku decides it is time to fight. And considering we still see Soifon in this week's episode, I'm definitely a little concerned for her. Kisuke is also shown to still be with the group, so it looks like he may end up running with them until they meet Gerard, as was the case in the manga. Either way, we're going to return to this scenario as early as next week, and I'm really excited. Kyoraku vs Lille is absolutely the fight I've been looking forward to the most in this core, so I'm hoping for the best. Meanwhile, moving on, we find ourselves in chapter 635 as Kenpachi Mayuri and their squad suddenly run into Sternritter C, Pernida Parnkgjas, the mysterious hooded Quincy appearing in their path. And by the way, there is no sign of Hinataro here anymore whatsoever, which is honestly a little disappointing. I had hoped we might avoid situations like this in the anime where they've now been given the benefit of hindsight when it comes to writing this, but Hinataro does appear to have totally vanished. Even among the shots of the entire group running, he's simply not there anymore. Now, it is possible the anime will include a joke later on, perhaps, that shows Hinataro lagging way behind, or maybe Mayuri ordered Hinataro to drag his dezombification tanks behind him so he's moving really slowly, but for now, he's just gone. In the manga, Hinataro also vanished here, and Kubo later revealed in a series of volume sketches that he was paralysed by hearing the upcoming scream of Mayuri Shikai. Again though, that's something they could have just shown here in the episode, but alas. As Kenpachi wonders what Pernida is, Mayuri mocks the captain, claiming to ignore anyone stupid enough to ask a question about something they've both only just seen for the first time. However, Kenpachi isn't waiting around. Charging forward, Kenpachi rushes Pernida, deciding to just kill the Sternritter outright. As Kenpachi reaches the hooded Quincy, however, his sword aloft, Mayuri suddenly cries out, realising something is wrong. Kenpachi attempts to bring his sword down upon Pernida's head, but the Quincy's eyes flash, and something connects with Kenpachi's arm. In an instant, Kenpachi manages to dart backwards, however, blood splashes onto the floor. The camera pans down to reveal that Kenpachi's arm has been ruined, the bones twisted and broken inside the skin, rivers of blood pouring from his wounds. I'm actually kind of impressed that Kenpachi can still hold his sword, despite the rest of his arm being completely destroyed, but I guess that shouldn't be too surprising. One thing that does bug me about this episode, though, is the constant use of extreme close-ups. I remember a similar thing happening off the top of my head, I think it was episode 18, Rages at Ringside, that would often use serious close-ups that don't really make any sense, cutting out a large portion of a character's expression or even their mouth while they're talking and just filling the entire screen. This episode features a similar artistic choice and it just doesn't look good in my opinion. Either way, Kenpachi notes that in exchange for his arm, he managed to crack the enemy's head wide open, and sure enough, from a split in Pernida's hood, a fountain of blood gushes out. I've never quite understood this from the manga either. I guess Kenpachi cut in between Pernida's fingers. That sounds really painful, to be honest. But unless I've missed it, there's never any injury shown on Pernida whatsoever. Regardless, Pernida's hood looks as though it is about to collapse when suddenly the creature's head swells to an enormous size, crackling Ryatsu zipping around it. And I have to say that this was quite nostalgic for me in some sense, because back in the day, Kubo did a really awesome job with stringing us along in regards to Pernida. It was actually a really exciting mystery that I was quite invested in, and I found the answer to be very satisfying back in the day as well. In a new moment, Pernida fires its nerves outwards from all sides, using them to anchor itself, I assume, to the surrounding buildings before ripping them free again, kicking up a dust cloud. As we reach the end of chapter 635, Kenpachi wonders again what Pernida is, as Mayuri continues to mock him. After the opening, we find ourselves at the start of chapter 636. In the manga, Pernida swells into the shape of a fairly obvious fist, if you know what to look for, but initially here in the episode, Pernida's movements don't seem to make any physical sense at all, based off what we know about it. Its hood is rippling with the movement of its fingers, but it is moving as though it's on a repeating cycle almost, like water flowing, as though the fingers are growing, then shrinking, then disappearing altogether, and then just resetting and repeating that cycle again and again, as though the smallest of fingers shrink into absolutely nothing, and then regrow out of the top of Pernida's head again. Maybe that's happening, but we've never seen any evidence that it works like that. As Kenpachi and Mayuri continue to bicker and discuss Pernida, Ikkaku, Yumichika and Nemu watch from the sidelines, with Ikkaku muttering that they missed their chance to intervene. I'm not entirely sure why that is, unless it's simply because Kenpachi himself has already launched an attack and therefore they feel like they shouldn't get in the way. As Nemu voices her own opinion on the matter, surprising the others, their exchange foreshadows the second half of the fight. Nemu muses that Mayuri would likely never feel threatened enough to call for her help in battle, while Ikkaku thinks the same of his captain. Again, this dialogue is plucked straight from the manga. There really is very little new content this week. Suddenly, Kenpachi's destroyed arm begins to twist violently, spinning round and round rapidly, spraying blood all over the place. With his skin and muscles now warped and coiled like a spring, Kenpachi uses his free hand to grab the renegade limb and tear it clean off. The manga makes it much clearer here that Pernida is trying to use Kenpachi's arm to attack him with his own sword, whereas again the extreme close-up here in the anime doesn't really give off that idea. With his arm now on the ground, Kenpachi stamps on it and rips his Zanpakuto toe free of his grip in what was always a really nice piece of action, tearing off two of his fingers at the same time, showing just how tightly Pernida was holding onto the blade. The shriveled up arm then bounces across the floor before warping into nothing but a puddle of blood, the limb vanishing before Pernida itself in a really cool anime-exclusive shot. Mayuri approaches Kenpachi, commending him for his quick thinking in tearing off his arm, noting that his entire body would likely be lost by now if he hadn't. Kenpachi wonders if Mayuri is picking a fight with him, before asking again what Pernida's ability is. While Mayuri still claims not to know, in reality it is more that he is goading Kenpachi into attacking in order to confirm any hypotheses the scientist might currently have. Again, I really like this dialogue between the two of them. It shows just how completely incompatible they really are, despite being both immensely strong assets in their own right. Perhaps that's ultimately the problem. But I can feel their individual frustrations with each other, and to be honest, Mayuri would be an absolute nightmare to talk to. However, as Mayuri notes that all they can do for now is to stay away from Pernida, Kenpachi instead charges in once again, deciding that if Pernida has a mysterious power, then all he has to do is cut him down before he can use it. It's really weird that Kenpachi's mouth doesn't move at all as he says this. I guess he could be thinking it, but there's no real indication of that, and in the manga he is talking to Mayuri for obvious reasons. As Kenpachi bears down upon Pernida, however, the captain brings up his sword and swipes in a massive pendulum swing, driving it down onto Pernida's head once again. Let's be clear, this is not Kenpachi's finest hour. He's normally a lot smarter than this in battle, even if he doesn't look it. Considering he literally just tried this same strike a moment ago, and not only did it do nothing at all to Pernida, but it cost him his arm, I'm surprised Kenpachi's usually finely tuned battle senses didn't kick in. For example, why didn't he try stabbing Pernida's eyes through the hood? Anything different would have been better. Alas, Kenpachi strikes Pernida. But the Quincy's eyes predictably flash once again, and this time, both of Kenpachi's legs are instantly destroyed. This was a crazy moment in the manga, and I'm glad to see it left untouched here in the episode. I would love to know what anime-only viewers thought of this. This is one of the fastest on-screen defeats a captain has ever experienced, and the fact it's Kenpachi of all people is completely crazy. As Kenpachi begins to roar in agony, his entire body falls under Pernida's control, and it looks like it's over for him. When suddenly a familiar-looking gold blade bursts through Kenpachi's back, instantly immobilizing him. Mayuri appears, having stabbed Kenpachi with his Shikai Ashisogi Jizo, which paralyzes its victim's limbs. Despite this, Kenpachi's neck then begins to twist instead, so Mayuri resorts to more extreme measures. Activating a new ability of his Shikai Ashisogi Jizo Fear Level 4, Mayuri jams his thumb into his Zanpakuto's eye, causing it to bleed and the weapon to scream a terrible, chilling cry. As Nemu notes to Ikkaku and Yumichika, hearing the scream for 4 seconds will paralyse you completely, so they need to cover their ears, and in the volume sketches this is what puts Hanataro out of commission. Now rendered immobile from head to toe, Kenpachi's life has been saved. Pernida's power can no longer move him at all. It is wild to think that Kenpachi came this close to meeting a truly grisly end right here, but that's the nature of the Schutzstaffel battles. However, now turning his attention to Pernida itself, Mayuri steps forward, revealing he's discovered the truth behind Pernida's mysterious ability: nerves. Pernida's the Compulsory uses its own nerves to attack its enemy's body, forcibly controlling their movements. Mayuri surmises that Pernida controls its nerves in a method similar to the Quincy's Blute vein. In the same way they pump reishi into their own veins, Pernida can do so into its nerves. Hearing this, Pernida unleashes its nerves, sending them barreling towards the captain. However, Mayuri simply uncorks a bottle of acid and soaks the exposed nerves, seriously injuring Pernida. There are a couple of things to discuss here. For starters, Pernida's nerves are red in this scene when later they inexplicably become white. I'm not really sure what's behind the colour change, but I do much prefer the red version. They look more like creepy, almost fleshy, internal pieces of one's body than a strange spider's web or something. And secondly, as it recoils in agony after Mayuri splashes it with acid, Pernida lets out the first sound we've ever heard it make. A weird, high-pitched squeal that sounds almost like a baby's cry. Again, this is much closer to how I imagined Pernida sounding in the manga than what comes later, and this makes a lot more sense to me as well. Pernida is supposed to be, at least mentally, in its infancy during the first stages of this fight, so the high-pitched squeak works very well. And it's a shame that we never hear it actually talk like this, because the idea is that Pernida is meant to evolve over time. If its voice had gradually deepened before even taking on a cadence like Kenpachi's later on, that would have been awesome. Plus, this is a major reason why, for me at least, Pernida's dialogue doesn't land later in the fight. It's meant to have a childlike cheekiness to it as it continues to get one over Mayuri, but now it just sounds like it takes itself weirdly too seriously. Anyway, we're getting ahead of ourselves. As we begin chapter 637, Mayuri goes on a lengthy monologue, again taken straight from the manga, where he thanks Kenpachi for helping him discover the enemy's power. Despite being paralysed by both Ashisogi Jizo and its Fear Level 4 ability, Kenpachi can still move his eye, highlighting to Mayuri that he needs to improve the paralysis powers of his Zanpakuto some more. Again foreshadowing events to come, Yumichika tells Nemu that her captain is a piece of work, to which she mysteriously notes that she hopes he is. In retrospect, I'm not really sure what it is about the nature of this fight in particular that gets her so concerned for Mayuri's safety at this point, but still it does a nice job at setting the scene to come. I also love Mayuri's line about noble victories being built on the backs of noble sacrifices, especially as we see what Kenpachi has been reduced to. It's brutal, but very good stuff. As Mayuri asks that Pernida submit itself to him as a valuable research specimen for experimentation, he pulls a brilliantly evil face, grinning at his enemy. But Pernida doesn't seem to agree. As the sternritter begins to freak out, its eyes spinning rapidly, enormous spikes suddenly burst out of the ground around it before excavating the stone in a massive blast. This is completely new, and to be honest, I have no idea what it really accomplishes outside of looking cool, but I mean, maybe that's enough. Pernida's head suddenly swells massively, ballooning in size, before its hood finally tears in half, at last revealing what is inside. The left arm of the Soul King now stands before a shocked Mayuri, its grotesque eye on full display as it curls its chained fingers. I have to say, in this initial reveal shot, I think Pernida looks pretty good, but strangely its voice has already changed, despite there not really being a reason for it to do so. Even here, before it has freed itself from its seal, the voice has deepened, and it's bellowing at Mayuri in a way that immediately took me out of the episode. I don't think it really works. At this point, it should still have a higher pitched squeak, but there you go. Pernida then frees itself from its chains by breaking them apart with ease, which makes them seem a little pointless, to be honest, and sadly the anime has removed a cool detail from the manga here. In the original chapter, Pernida releases itself by sending its nerves into its own fingers, violently forcing them open to shatter the chains. It was a nice character detail. Anyway, now free of its bindings, Pernida grows absolutely enormous, the rest of its arm bulging and slamming into the ground as sinewy flesh and muscle begins to wriggle and writhe from the end of the arm itself, almost as though it's looking for the rest of its body. Pernida then continues to grow, rising up above the city streets, once again letting out a ridiculous sounding roar that is more comical than threatening. And here we may as well rip the band-aid off and get it over with. I don't like how Pernida looks or sounds in the episode, sadly, after ruminating on it some more. Pernida looks like a model from a video game. Combine that with the bad lighting, that's at times a mix of way too dark or weirdly too bright, the flat textures, the looped animation, and the low frame rate, and you've got something that does not mesh at all with the rest of the episode. In some instances, this can work fine. I think Komamura's Bankai is a much better implemented example, even if I still think it would have looked better hand-drawn. But I get it. The Bankai is meant to be weird and unnatural, and the same goes for, say, Rose's Bankai too. But Pernida is different. It's an actual character, not an apparition. It's a part of this world, even if it is weird and eldritch. Ultimately though, no matter how weird it is just a flesh and bone arm. Should Reo himself have been rendered in CG too by that logic? In the manga, Pernida was quite a menacing and threatening villain despite its goofy appearance. Here it's just goofy. I'm definitely more than a little concerned for the remainder of the Schutzstaffel fights if Leel's Volstendish, or God forbid Gerard's Titan form, looks like this. I think it's going to be a tough sell. The weird and honestly kind of stupid noises it keeps making don't help its case either. To be honest, as we go through the episode, a lot of the time, the quality of Pernida's depiction depends heavily on the angle. For example, I think it looks really bad in this particular shot, especially since it is just repeating what looks like a looped idle animation. But later on, say in this shot, I don't find it nearly as egregious. And to be honest, Pernida is much better here in the episode when it isn't making any sound. But anyway, Pernida continues to fire its nerves at Mayuri, which again are now white for some reason, and Mayuri defends himself with these weird, inflatable living umbrellas, which again is pure Mayuri brilliance. The way the umbrellas make groaning noises as they are zapped by the nerves and keep crumbling, only to be instantly rejuvenated by Mayuri, is a great depiction. As Ikkaku tells Mayuri to get out of there, wondering how the captain can be so happy, Mayuri responds with a mad glee on his face, exclaiming that he's discovered a never-before-seen subject that keeps exceeding his expectations. Pernida, seemingly annoyed by this, straightens up and unleashes an explosion of nerve bullets, the captain ducking and swerving to avoid them. As Mayuri tells the left arm to show him more, Pernida affirms that its name isn't Left Arm, but Pernida Parnkgjas. Again, I can't help but think a more childlike voice would have made way more sense in this scene. Pernida is still in its absolute earliest stages, to the point where it can barely string its name together. And it had a childlike voice when Mayuri attacked its nerves earlier, so I don't understand how or when that voice was dropped, to be honest. Beginning chapter 638, Pernida demands it be called by its name. However, Mayuri responds with one of my favourite Mayuri lines ever, where he notes that he was the one who discovered Pernida, not Pernida itself, which is brilliant. Anyway, what follows is another action sequence derived right from the manga. Pernida unleashes another set of nerves, ramming them into the ground and using them to rip up the floor itself, taking the shape of a giant stone hand which looms over Mayuri. Mayuri leaps out of the way and unleashes his extendable arm, which we haven't seen since the Soul Society arc, to grab onto a nearby building. Soaring through the air, Mayuri is suddenly shocked to see Pernida's nerves crawling up the same building, before also turning the wall in front of the captain into a huge stone hand, which sends Mayuri falling backwards through the air. In a new scene, Mayuri retracts his hand and then fires it again, this time in the opposite direction, swinging through the city streets to escape his pursuer. It's honestly a really nice action set piece. Mayuri accelerates as the stone hand smashes into the building behind him before he darts across the rooftop itself, really highlighting how physically capable Mayuri actually is when he needs to be. However, Pernida is a step ahead, conjuring a stone hand from the opposite tower as well, capturing Mayuri between the two of them as the stone hands crash together in a huge blast. We need to pause briefly to take a look at one of the key cards this week, the one regarding Pernida itself. As always, the translation was provided by Neonzel, and it reads, "The Schrift is C, representing the ability The Compulsory. This ability allows Pernida to infiltrate the enemy's body with its nerves and forcibly control their movements. Pernida's Schrift was not a power given by Yhwach, but was named after an ability Pernida originally possessed. Therefore, it is rumoured that Pernida's true identity is the left arm of the Soul King." So, this is rather interesting. Everything here about Pernida not being given a Schrift by Yhwach and who the other sternritter thought Pernida might actually be under the hood is actually explained by Askin in the source material, making me wonder if that dialogue has been cut. And guess what? That dialogue comes from the scene where Ichigo is turned into a rug. Could that scene have actually been removed from the anime? It is definitely a controversial one, so maybe it has been taken out. Or if not, perhaps Askin's dialogue has simply been trimmed down. Either way, it seems an odd choice to remove it, as this piece of lore is absolutely vital to really understanding Pernida and later Gerard. Returning to the episode, we have one of really only two totally new scenes this time, the first being the scene with Lil at the start, and now this one here featuring the turncoat Sternritter. Basby, Lil Toto and Giselle are still in the same place we left them last. Lil Toto notes that Basby has a personal score to settle with Hashwolf, which is interesting as it means he likely told them at least a bit of his story. She then tells Basby to just go and handle it, as they will kill Yhwach. I have to wonder, I like Lil Toto, but this seems absurd. And to be fair, I guess the manga had the same problem, but seriously, how did they think they stood even the most remote chance against Yhwach? They've been worshipping this guy like a god king for however long, and yet now Lil Toto, supposedly the brains of the Bambis, thinks she and Giselle alone will be able to conquer this insurmountable task. This scene is written a little weirdly though, in the sense that it seems like they won't be splitting up. Lil Toto floats the idea, to which Basby simply replies that he will kill both Yhwach and Hashwolf, implying they will try and do it together. I do like Giselle's line about wanting to see both Yhwach and Hashwath as zombies, though that would make her completely unstoppable. Anyway, returning to the main event, the stone hands explode, only for Mayuri to fall from the sky. But there's a difference. His famed sun suit is now gone for good, I'm afraid. He detonated the suit itself in an attempt to escape. Again, I've no idea how he does that without being injured, considering he was wearing it at the time, but that's Mayuri for you. And I love the audacity of the author as well, to treat the surrounding characters like the readers themselves, simply telling them he won't bother to explain how he managed to do it. It's good stuff. But yeah, this is Mayuri's new look for the remainder of the battle. It is short-lived, but he looks really cool here. This battle look of Mayuri's was always a favourite of mine. It doesn't have the same meme potential of the sunsuit, but that's a good thing here, I think. This change of appearance highlights the change in the stakes of this fight. And yeah, the anime does a great job with this look too. Plus, Mayuri's Hirenkyaku boots look excellent as well, enabling him to fly even under the Quincy's Reishi dominion. Just a small note, but it is interesting to me that Mayuri claimed back in the Soul Society arc to have completed his research on Quincy's, yet he doesn't know what the original name for Hirenkyaku is. I feel like that's a big oversight on his part as a scientist. However, Mayuri is now ready to take the fight to Pernida itself, and he flings an explosive that wraps itself around Pernida's little finger. The explosive is in fact a soul, which screams as Mayuri detonates it, removing Pernida's finger as the gigantic hand shrieks in pain. While the anime makes the human explosive much more obvious, it does appear in the manga like this too. Mayuri truly is a monster, who appears to have perfected his human bombs from the Soul Society arc for maximum efficiency. With Pernida's little finger now detached and on the ground, writhing like a snake, Mayuri covers it in a preserving solution, hoping to take it back with him once the battle is done. Suddenly, however, an eye appears on the disembodied finger's knuckle, and nerves latch onto Mayuri's outstretched hand. In a moment of panic, Mayuri watches as his own little finger is quickly snapped by Pernida's nerves. The captain instantly moves to protect himself, hastily performing surgery on his own right arm then and there, in order to reconfigure the arrangement of his nerves, saving him from further control. Although Mayuri might sound confident as he holds his newly stitched arm together, for perhaps the first time since his battle with Uryu in the Soul Society arc, the mad scientist is sweating. And it'll only get better from here. We then see Pernida, both the hand and the finger, staring at Mayuri. But again, I hate to belabor the point, that feeling of menace is completely lost here. In the manga, this is one of the coolest, creepiest panels of the fight, Pernida itself shadowed entirely, save for the sinister glow of its eyes. In the anime, the arm is waving like a tree, or one of those inflatable things you find outside car dealerships, and the lighting is so bright again all of a sudden. Now, I saw some people in the comments of my live reaction to the episode saying, well, you know, it moves around all of the time, it sways on the spot all of the time, because it is the left arm of advancement. It's moving all of the time because it embodies that. And I get it, I see where that idea comes from, but again, I just don't really buy it. Pernida embodies advancement and progression already inherently through its ability of the compulsory, which is an ability that belongs to it as the left arm of the Soul King, but also through its ability of evolution, which is perhaps the more obvious embodiment of advancement. The fact that Pernida moves around on the spot like a tree or whatever doesn't really, to me at least, seem to have anything to do with this idea of advancement. And by that logic then, should Mimihagi, the right arm of stillness, remain completely, perfectly still at all times and never move? But of course that simply wouldn't work because Mimihagi moves a lot in the way it rises up to reach the royal palace in order to achieve its job, because the idea of stillness exists inherently within it as part of its abilities, the ability to keep Ukitake alive and in a permanent state of stagnation, and to do the same thing to the Soul King and the Soul Society. So to me, This imagery of Pernida moving around weirdly flailing on the spot, I don't personally think it has anything to do with the idea of advancement. If it does, then fair enough, I suppose. Then I simply just don't like the direction they've taken it, I guess. But to me, the idea of advancement and progression, of stillness and stagnation, exist inherently within these arms and don't need to be reflected at a physical surface level again, or else Mimihagi simply would never move anywhere. And we know that's not the case. Anyway, starting chapter 639, Mayuri chastises his shoddy handiwork. Pernida mocks him for feeling embarrassed before asking if he wants to panic some more. Suddenly, the disembodied finger transforms, evolving into a full-sized hand that begins to stampede towards the captain, scuttling along the ground like a massive spider. Honestly, this scene looks great. I love the incredibly unsettling creepiness to the hand's movements, and this at last brings that sense of urgency that comes with this fight. The hand leaps towards Mayuri, but in a new moment, Mayuri grabs another of his human explosives and aims it like a slingshot at the hand, even using his extendable arm to increase his reach. That's a really fantastic character moment right there that the anime added. In the manga, Mayuri just tosses an unseen explosive at the hand instead. However, the main Pernida simply tears off its middle finger somehow and uses that to grow a third arm. Again, this is a really cool moment in the manga and it is brought to life well here. I also like that the anime kept in the nice character moment where Pernida accidentally drips blood in its eye. Again though, a childlike voice I think would have been better there, depicting how Pernida is inexperienced and making mistakes and it's kind of scared and unhappy about the fact that it got blood in its eye. But anyway, as the three Pernida arms rise up before Mayuri, I think this scene looks pretty good for the most part. If anything, it is the weird and frankly unfitting roar the arms make that again just takes me out of it. But Mayuri unsheaths his Zanpakuto at last, readying to take on all three at once. His golden eye gleaming greedily, Mayuri activates his Bankai. As Ikkaku and Yumichika rush to rescue their incapacitated captain, fearing a poison gas cloud from Konjiki Ashisogi Jizo, Mayuri rebuffs them, grinning that he'd never be so wasteful. Instead, the tip of his sword expands as a strange purple substance oozes from the blade, bubbling and building, inflating upon the end of Mayuri's Zanpakuto. While this is all we see of the transformation in the manga for the most part, here in the anime that deep purple substance takes the shape of a fetus that then slams into the ground before continuing to grow, evolving into a thrashing baby right before our eyes. From beneath that purple baby, a mass of bloodied tentacles suddenly swells and explodes outwards, lifting the grotesque creature into the air. As the dust clears, Mayuri's altered Bankai is revealed. Konjiki Ashisogi Jizo Matai Fukuin Shotai. Where there was once the familiar golden caterpillar with the face of a Jizo, now an enormous purple monstrosity sits languidly upon a throne of veiny tentacles. A gigantic, bastardized Buddha of sorts dressed in ceremonial robes, a pair of lanterns dangling from either side of its seat that cast a ghostly, sickly glow over the scene. The creature is clutching at its swollen stomach as it prepares to give birth, while Mayuri announces its name proudly. Interestingly, this is not a new Bankai for Mayuri per se, in the sense that it hasn't replaced his old one. Instead, this is an alteration, a variant of his Bankai that he can unleash should he wish, and now is the time. As Mayuri's despicable Bankai roars at the top of its voice, it suddenly gives birth in the middle of the battlefield. From its stomach, a gleaming golden Ashisogi Jizo emerges. While no longer a caterpillar, this shining baby does have numerous limbs and retains the same terrifyingly deep dark eyes as before. I'm a big fan of how the anime depicts Mayuri's altered Bankai here, to the point where I think this is a big success, and I'm kind of amazed at how big the gulf is, I think, between how Pernida is portrayed and how the new Bankai is. The initial Bankai form looks suitably horrifying and yet perversely regal at the same time, while the golden Jizo is satisfyingly simplistic in its design. I also absolutely love the fact that it is actually glowing gold, bringing some light to this scene in the most unthinkable way. Pernida attempts to attack the Jizo with its nerves once again. Here they really look like spider webs, but nothing happens. Also, why are the 3 arms just bursting out of the ground? Anyway, in what is a genuinely freaky moment, the giant baby then bellows, catching sight of its first meal, and it stampedes towards Pernida. Grabbing the first of the great arms, the baby devours it whole, Pernida screaming all the while. As the baby grapples with the other 2 arms, it consumes them both, the main Pernida body eaten last. Mayuri gloats that Pernida can try to resist if it likes, but it won't be able to save itself, as we see Pernida's horrified expression as the hand disappears into the gaping maw of the baby, seemingly once and for all. Elated with himself, Mayuri's face contorts into a twisted look of demented glee, while Nemu looks on from the shadows as chapter 639 comes to an end. I adore the tiny new anime edition where the Jizo kind of sits back and sighs heavily after consuming such a meal. That honestly gives it so much more character. But as we begin chapter 640, the episode ends with Mayuri throwing back his head and laughing maniacally, doing his best supervillain impression. Honestly, for as disappointed as I've been by some aspects of this week's episode, this is an incredible way to end things off. Mayuri's voice actor completely nails the evil laugh, and it is brought to life in such a wonderful way. The artwork of Mayuri is perfect as well, and it's all topped off by a fantastic title card to boot. And so, as Mayuri's hubris reaches its apex, the episode comes to an end. Is the battle really over? Well, if you're watching this, you likely already know that no, it isn't. In fact, we're only really halfway through. Anyway, the ending is still playing in reverse and has been uploaded to YouTube with the title New World Edition, which tells me that this is just to highlight the core's halfway point and how the Shinigami are now on the back foot, as I speculated last time. However, there is a fantastic new detail here where Pernida is now shown in its true form, uncloaked, and it looks great. And again, as I mentioned last time, it makes me wonder if there will be more changes throughout the ending as the episodes continue. Perhaps the biggest surprise of the episode, however, as I mentioned at the start of the video, comes in the form of this week's poem. The image depicts the sinister, shadowy pine needles of none other than Kyoraku's Bankai, while Kyoraku himself reads, "Pine needles scatter over a glistening stage in bright red. Shunned from the heavens, come now to the depths of hell." Honestly, if that isn't one of the coolest poems we have ever had, then I don't know what is. The poem seems to be directly referencing Kyoraku's Bankai, but also possibly Leal himself, referring to one who has been shunned from the heavens, perhaps after losing his halo. However, there's no way we're going to see that next week, but regardless, what an exciting poem. And once again, with no Sternritter in memorial this week, this seems like a good time to move on to the predictions for next week, episode 35, Don't Chase a Shadow. So that was a surprise. What does it mean for next week and the continuation of Mayuri versus Pernida if Kyoraku versus Leal is already happening? For starters, if the anime is swapping between fights in an effort to show them playing out concurrently, I'm not sure how I feel about that. One of the best things about these early Schutzstaffel fights in particular was how grandiose they felt, and that was thanks to them receiving so much dedicated consecutive time. I'm also not sure what the benefit is to having these battles playing out concurrently, save for muddying the water. They also don't play out this way in the manga. In fact, the manga explicitly depicts Kyoraku's battle only taking place once Mayuri is already down, as both he and Kisuke sense the scientist's Ryatsu disappearing. But this poem doesn't necessarily mean we aren't seeing the remainder of the battle next time, and it also doesn't necessarily mean that cutting between the fights is a bad thing. It's possible the remainder of Mayuri versus Pernida only takes up the first half of the episode or so, but I'm not convinced by that either. I'm sure we will see it, it's just a question of how much. So I wonder where Mayuri's fight might end then in order to transition over to Kyoraku's scenes. You need a fitting cliffhanger. Perhaps with the end of chapter 640 where Nemu rescues Mayuri from the arrow. Or maybe it'll be even earlier than that, with Pernida destroying the Jizo and rising up from its remains to stare Mayuri down. I wonder, next week's episode is called Don't Chase a Shadow, and despite the emphasis on Kyoraku's Bankai, will it go any further than that? I wouldn't be surprised if the episode ended with Kyoraku activating Bankai and that was it. So here's what I think might happen. Episode 36 will be called something like Never Ending My Dream, and will feature the end of Mayuri vs Pernida, while episode 37 will be called The Theatre Suicide, and feature Kyoraku battling Lille with his Bankai. Honestly, Kyoraku's fight is actually a little longer than Mayuri's. Could we see it stretch to 2 and a bit episodes? We need room for the Friend Saga though. It's tricky, that's for sure. There are some preview images for next time as well, as always, and I have to say, I'm very excited. From just this brief glimpse, the art looks excellent. And would you look at that? A new Askin shot. Are we really going to get Ichigo versus Askin after all? Could this be the week Ichigo is turned into a rug? I don't think so personally. That shot of Ichigo that we get in the preview images is when he rushes Askin just as they both feel the effects of Kyoraku's Bankai. Actually, thinking about that then, maybe episode 35 will end with Kyoraku decapitating Lille. But that just seems like an awful lot of plot to get through, but I guess we'll see. But anyway, that's it for episode 34 of the 1000-Year Blood War arc titled Baby Hold Your Hand. Definitely the most conflicting episode for me of the course so far. It was polarising. There were things I really did love about it, but also things that I was quite disappointed by, namely the portrayal of Pernida. Actually, that was really only about it, but it's quite a big part of the episode. Again, all this means is that the animator's particular choice of direction didn't really connect with me this time, unlike it has so many other times in the past, and yeah, that is a bit of a shame, and I do kind of wish that I enjoyed Pernida a bit more, but unfortunately that is just how it is this time for me. But do let me know down in the comments below how you felt about episode 34, Baby Hold Your Hand. As I said, I've seen a lot of debate in the community. Some people really loved the episode and that's absolutely fantastic. Do please let me know down in the comments below if you did. Once again, guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you took something of value away from it as well. And as always, I want to end by saying a massive thank you and giving a huge shout out to my wonderful supporters over on Patreon who make this channel possible. If you enjoy the work that I do here over on YouTube and you want to support for me another step further, then thank you so very much. By supporting me at the $1 tier a month, you can get your name in the credits of every episode just like this. And by supporting me at $2 or higher, you can enjoy every video I release absolutely free of baked-in YouTube ads. Alright guys, thank you again so very much for watching. Until next time, I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.